So this is just from the very beginning of my novel, The Girls. I looked up because of the laughter and kept looking because of the girls. I noticed their hair first, long and uncombed, then their jewelry catching the sun. The three of them were far enough away that I saw only the periphery of their features, but it didn't matter. I knew they were different from everyone else in the park. Families milling in a vague line, waiting for sausages and burgers from the open grill. Women in checked blouses scooting into their boyfriends' sides. Kids tossing eucalyptus buttons at the feral-looking chickens that overran the strip. These long-haired girls seemed to glide above all that was happening around them, tragic and separate, like royalty in exile. I studied the girls with a shameless, blatant gape. It didn't seem possible that they might look over and notice me. My hamburger was forgotten in my lap, the breeze blowing in minnow stink from the river. It was an age when I'd immediately scan and rank other girls, keeping up a constant tally of how I fell short, and I saw right away that the black-haired one was the prettiest. I had expected this, even before I'd been able to make out their faces. There was a suggestion of otherworldliness hovering around her, a dirty smock dress barely covering her ass. She was flanked by a skinny redhead and an older girl, dressed with the same shabby afterthought, as if dredged from a lake, all their cheap rings like a second set of knuckles. They were messing with an uneasy threshold, prettiness and ugliness at the same time, and a ripple of awareness followed them through the park. Mothers glancing around for their children, moved by some feeling they couldn't name. Women reaching for their boyfriends' hands. The sun spiked through the trees like always, the drowsy willows, the hot wind gusting over the picnic blankets, but the familiarity of the day was disturbed by the path the girls cut across the regular world, sleek and thoughtless as sharks breaching the water. Thanks.
I'm going to read from the middle of my novel. You just need to know it's 1960 and Georgia. The room is small, cramped, and uncomfortably warm with no windows or fan. A rectangular wooden table and chairs. They are adult chairs, yet the four grown-ups stand while only the two little Negro boys are seated, their legs dangling. They work in coloring books. When the lawyer walks in, all eyes turn to him. The older child sits on the opposite side of the table facing the door, which the guard now closes as he exits. The younger's back is to the door, so he has to turn around to see the visitor. He is the first person in the room to speak. "Are you Mr. Campbell?" "Yes," says Elliot, who takes off his hat and holds it in his hands. "I am." The boy scrambles out of his chair to stand and shake his attorney's hand with the formality of the gentry. "How do you do?" The adults are Claudette and Ronald Price, the parents of 7-year-old Jordan, and Howard and Minnie Williams, the parents of 9-year-old Max. They introduce themselves to Elliot. "Where's Dee Dee?" Mrs. Price asks. Elliot is confused. "Miss Wilcox." She must have gotten held up. Jordan's mother seems stricken, as if this is yet another bad omen. "This a fire truck, Mr. Campbell," says Jordan. "Fire truck, I color it red." He makes a siren sound, moving his picture through the air. "Can I wear your hat?" Max asks, and Elliot gives it to him. Max puts it on, and it falls over his eyes. He giggles, then pushes it back on his head so he can see before resuming his coloring. "This a Dalmatian," says Jordan. "The page is white, but white crayon make Dalmatian whiter. This the fireman. Max make him pink, but I just leave him be, like the page white, but not white like the Dalmatian. I traced it. See? I traced it. Look like the real picture. See?" "I see. What did you color, Max?" Elliot takes a chair, sitting on an end of the table between the boys. "Train." Max had done a very studied rendering of an engineer standing outside a passenger car, kindly talking to a porter. Both men are pink. "That's very nice, Max, but you could have made those men brown." Both boys stop coloring to look up and gape at Elliot. "My father was a porter, like him, and colored men can be engineers and firemen too." The children look down at their pictures, then back up at Elliot, blinking. Elliot asks gently, "You boys want to tell me what happened?" Max sighs, tired of the question, but Jordan jumps in, seeming to delight in this reversal of children should be seen and not heard. Whenever he tells this story, he has all the adults' undivided attention. "We was playing with Jenny Dodgson and Lacey Pike, and Jenny Dodgson's daddy's the fireman, and he the mailman too, and I don't know what Lacey's daddy do. And Jenny go, 'How old is you?' And I say 7, and I say, 'I'm 7 too.' And Max go, 'I'm 9, and Lacey say, 'I'm 8, and Jenny say, 'You want to play dolls?' And I say, 'Dolls is for girls.' And she say, 'You want to play hide and go seek?' And I say, 'Okay, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and we find her and Lacey in Miss Delarose's bushes. And Jenny go, 'You want to touch my hair?' And I say, 'Okay,' her hair straight and yellow. And Lacey go, 'You want to touch my hair? It red.' And I say, 'Okay.' And Jenny go, 'I seen Bieber and Sissy Gompers kissing.' Bieber, Jenny's big brother. And Jenny go, 'You want to kiss me?' And she stick her lips out. And I go, 'Okay.' And I kissed her right on the lips. Peck. And she laugh. And Lacey go to Max. And Lacey say, 'I know how to kiss.' And Max say, 'Okay.' And Lacey go to Max. Peck. And we find a frog. We pick up that frog, but it slip away. Hop, hop. We go home for supper and knock on the door. And Mama get the door. Then she go, 'Not Jordan, Ron.' And me and Daddy come running to the door. Her voice sound like we ought to come running to the door. And a police standing there. And policemen say, 'You kiss a white girl, boy?' Policeman look mad. Policeman say, 'Jenny, tell her daddy we was kissing.' Policeman say, 'You know that's a white girl. You know that's a white girl.' And policeman got a gun in his pocket. He keep tapping it. And they put the handcuffs on me. Click. And they put me in the paddy wagon. And Mama crying and me crying. And then they drive. And then they park. They park a long time. And then come Max in the handcuffs crying. They put him in the paddy wagon. His mama crying. And in the jail, they punch us in the tummy. They punch us in the legs and the back a long time. Bang, bang, bang. My tummy hurt. And every day we say, 'Can we see our mama?' And they say, 'Should have thought of that when you go raping little white girls.' And then our mama and daddy come. And then the judge say, 'The reformatory.' And they send us here, the reformatory. And they make us pick strawberries in the sun hot. And they make us talk to the psychologist. And the psychologists say, 'You ought to be castrated.' And the psychologists say, 'You know what castrated mean?' And we say no. And the psychologists tell us. Jordan's eyes are filled, his demeanor completely changed, as if at the beginning of his narrative, his enthusiasm in having a new adult as a captive audience had caused him to temporarily forget his story's terrifying end. Elliot turns to the other child and speaks softly. "Now you tell me, Max." Like he say, Max had continued to color throughout Jordan's testimony and doesn't look up from his task now. Elliot talks to the parents quietly a few minutes. They are interrupted by a quick knock, followed by the guard poking his head in. 2 minutes. He shuts the door. Mrs. Price wipes her eyes. "Come give Mama a kiss goodbye." "No!" Jordan runs to his mother, throwing his arms around her legs. "I want to go home." She reaches down, embracing him. "That's why we going to talk with Mr. Campbell now, baby. That's what we trying to figure out." "You be a good boy, all right?" Mrs. Williams instructs, and she and her husband walk over to kiss Max, who never looks up, never stops coloring. "May I have my hat back, Max?" Max stands, takes it off, and hands it to Elliot. Then he stares up at his lawyer. "Can I ask you a question?" Of course. Elliot stoops next to the child, and Max cups his hand around his own mouth and Elliot's ear. When my mama kissed me, that don't count as rape, do it? It only rape when I kiss back, right?
Hello, good evening. So I'm going to read from the beginning of my novel, Here Comes the Sun. I used to be black like you, but look at me. Miss Ruby turns her head from side to side for Tandy to see her salmon-colored skin, delicate with the texture of scalded milk. See how bright my skin come? If you follow instructions, yours will get this way quicker. Now that you have the Queen of Pearl, you might be lucky. If you want faster results, use it twice a day. She rubs the concoction up and down Tandy's neck, back, arms, and shoulders. She rubs everywhere but her butt crack. Miss Ruby is hardly tender. Tandy wonders if Miss Ruby's roughness is punishment for not having followed her earlier instructions. She imagines her blackness peeling off. The hydrogen peroxide Miss Ruby pours into the mixture, acting like an abrasive, a medicine for her melancholy. She closes her eyes as the warm formula touches her skin. Miss Ruby works her way to Tandy's chest. The circular motion of a stranger's hands on her breast makes Tandy blush. She has never been touched this way. She opens her eyes and searches for something, anything, that can take her mind off the sensation of this strange woman's fingers. She imagines herself as a fish Miss Ruby rubs down with salt and vinegar before frying. Her eyes find the ceiling. Had she been able to lift her arms, she would trace the things she sees projected from her mind. Luckily, you have good hair already, Miss Ruby says. Good coolie hair. Your daddy's an Indian? I don't know, Tandy says, still staring up at the planks in the ceiling. Never met him. Well, God played a cruel trick on you, because, child, if your skin was as pretty as your hair, you'd be one gorgeous woman. Miss Ruby isn't saying anything Tandy hasn't heard before. Her mother says the same thing, often shaking her head the way she does over burned food that has gone to waste. It's a pity you never have skin like your daddy. Tandy's neither the nutmeg brown that makes her older sister Margot an honorable mistress, a rung lower than a bright-skinned wife, nor is she black like her mother Dolores, whose skin makes people sympathetic when they see her. Who want to be black like that in this place? Miss Ruby once said to Tandy about her mother. Miss Ruby gives Tandy the homemade mixture in the jar for her to apply as needed. Only as needed, she stresses. These are very strong chemicals that could kill you. She then reaches for the saran wrap and begins to wrap Tandy's arms and torso. A mummified Tandy sits and listens to Miss Ruby's instructions. If you want quicker results, leave on the plastic. Don't wash, don't go in the sun. If you have to go in the sun for whatever reason, make sure stay covered up at all times from head to toe. If you start to feel like you're going to faint, just drink water. It makes you sweat more. But whatever you do, not take off the plastic. And remember, stay out to that sun. Miss Ruby repeats these words like an ominous warning, her eyes pouring into Tandy's. Tandy listens and nods, though she wants to rip the saran wrap off and jump into the river. She imagines her skin boiling, becoming molten liquid underneath the plastic wrap. Do I have to wear this all the time? Tandy asks. Heat and sweat is the advantage. Just bear it, Miss Ruby says, stamping her with a look. Tandy regrets saying anything, sensing her complaint might be interpreted as her wanting less out of life, less opportunity, less chance of attracting the type of boys her mother and sister want her to attract, the type who will be at the party for sure, less chance of acceptance in school, less chance to flunk school, the only ship on which black girls like her could float, given that their looks will never do it for them. Her mother tells her this too. The only thing you have going for you is your education. No ruin it. Meanwhile, the unintelligent brownings in school end up with modeling contracts or with boyfriends with money they can spend on them. The less attractive ones get good jobs in their family businesses. What else does she have to fall back on if she fails the exam besides her drawings? But no one wants those. No one respects an artist. So when Tandy puts her clothes on, she pretends to ignore the crinkling of the plastic under her uniform and the nausea that comes over her. Miss Ruby examines her skin, her eyes like a sharp razor raking over Tandy's body, as though looking for areas she might have missed, dark patches that need to be rubbed, scrubbed down like the bottom of a burned pot. Or the way she used to scale fish, her eyes having them a subtle hostility that reminds Tandy of the way the girls and nuns at school look at her. Can she tell Tandy doesn't belong? Can she sniff her deceit? Perhaps in that moment, Tandy reminds her of someone who did her wrong, or of herself, the way she looked before she bleached her skin. How suddenly her mood changes once Tandy pays her the money. Remember to stay out of that sun like I tell you, Miss Ruby says, because you and I both know God no like ugly. Thank you.
So I'm going to read from the middle of my novel. Charles hadn't really known that Black people in America could live outside a city, could grow in wilderness until he found Laurel. When they first met, she still smelled like fresh pine sap. It was subtle, most noticeable right behind her ears and under her chin. He told her, and she'd been mortified and then insisted he must be joking, but he wasn't. She'd always smelled like wide open country to him. He made her tell him everything about her home, the tree farm, the hills. Once she mentioned picking fiddleheads from the weeds in the woods behind her house, brushing off their paper veils and secretly biting the fresh curls until they burst into green in her mouth. My mother said they'd make me sick, but they never did. She did not find that wondrous at all, thought him odd for thinking so. It was just stuff you eat as a kid on your way to school, like chewing on hay, she said, as if chewing hay was normal too. The farm was gone by the time they met. Her parents mortgaged it to send her to college, and then her father died of pneumonia shortly before her graduation, followed by her mother a few months later. In the wilds of their early love, Charles promised Laurel he would buy it back for her, and she'd said, "Don't bother." She told him about the oblivion of Maine, the cotton balls in her ears, the breath suspended, but that didn't put him off. It made him want it more. Even the racism up there in the country seemed bucolic to him, much better than the squawks and loud calls of the college students in Central Square, who liked to mark their territory by catcalling insults at him from the doorways of bars he'd walked past for years. He considered it the major failure of his and Laurel's life together, that at the end of their first decade of marriage, he still hadn't made enough money to get them to the green. When they were first dating, Laurel worked at a city hospital. Her boss put her in charge of a patient named Ned. Ned was 7, but the same size as a 2-year-old. He'd been found tied to a metal post in a barn in Vermont. His teeth were rotten, nearly mush. He had never tasted solid food. His family fed him 1 carton of whole milk tossed into the barn at sunrise every morning, Laurel told Charles, her eyes shining. Ned had a birth defect, a soft opening at the back of his skull that never closed, only opened wider as he grew. And Ned's parents weren't bad people. They kept him in the barn for his protection, they claimed, and tried to overlook the problem of a hole in the head. As for feeding him only milk, they were only worried the strain of chewing might upset the gap. By the time the proper authorities got a hold of him, it was too late for Ned to learn to speak, and Laurel was supposed to teach him to sign. Laurel told Charles that every night Ned was in her care, they lay together side by side, his back against her front, so that he wouldn't roll over in sleep and crush his gap and die in the spoils of his own brain. She held Ned tight, careful not to brush his head. She clasped his hands, muffled in hospital mittens, between her own to keep him from scratching. While he slept, she studied the hollow in his head. I forced myself to do it, she told Charles, and Charles knew then that he loved her. It used to scare me, she told him. It was so open. She could see under the whispers of Ned's bright blonde hair the mysterious whorls and lines of his brain. I could look at it all day, she told Charles. She thought she could see Ned's brain pulse. It's It's like, she'd sputtered, searching for the right words. It's like love, he'd supplied her, and she'd smiled, grateful. That's when he knew they would make it together. Yes, it's exactly like love, she replied. And then she thought a moment, corrected them both. No, it is love. She fingerspelled into Ned's palm and told Charles excitedly about seeing flashes of recognition in his eyes. She bathed Ned twice a day, attempting to rid his skin of the dried mushroom musk of the barn, but it never completely went away. I just want him to survive in this world, she'd said, and Charles had understood. He wanted Ned to live too. The world would prove to be a kinder place, a bigger place than the circuit of Chalk Street and Maine's blinding whiteness, if something like Ned and his hollow lived in it. Thanks.
I'm just going to read a paragraph. I think all you need to know is that the narrator is an American high school teacher living in Sofia, Bulgaria. Mitko is a younger Bulgarian man whom he met in a public bathroom and paid for sex. This is the first night they have spent together in the narrator's apartment. And the last few hours, Mitko has been on Skype, setting up dates with other clients. My fatigue was a kind of agitation now. I kept opening and closing the book I held unread on my lap. I couldn't find what I had found in it before. The recovery of something like nobility from the mawkishness of desire, the sense that stray meetings in dark rooms, or the shadowy commerce of my own evening could burn with genuine luminosity, rubbing up against the realm of the ideal, ready at an instant to become metaphysics. I set the book aside, seeing that Mitko was tired, too tired and noticeably drunk. He had emptied nearly 2/3 of the bottle we had bought. He was unsteady on his feet when he stood up, having said goodbye to the man in Plovdiv and having announced his intention finally to sleep. There were 3 hours left until we would have to wake, he for his short trip to Plovdiv, a couple of hours on a comfortable bus, and I for a day of teaching, when I would stand before my class wearing a face scrubbed of the eagerness and servility and need it wore as I followed Mitko to the bathroom. Standing behind him, he was still naked as he stood to piss. I rubbed his chest and stomach, lean and taut, the skin of my hands catching just slightly on the bristles of hair, and then, at his words of permission or encouragement, something like, "Go on, I don't mind," my hands went lower, and gingerly I took the base of his cock and wrapped my hand around the shaft, feeling beneath my fingers the flow of water, heavy and urgent, and feeling too my own urgency, the hardness I pressed against him. He leaned his head back, pressing his face against mine, rubbing it. It too was stubbled and rough against the softness of my own, and I felt him harden as he finished pissing, as I carefully skinned him back and shook the last of it, feeling almost suffocated with longing, having never touched anyone in that way before, having never before been of that particular service. Mitko turned to me and kissed me, deeply and searchingly and possessingly, at the same time pushing me backward down the hallway toward the bedroom, pushing me and perhaps also using me for support to the broad bed where we had lain together earlier and where now we lay down again. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me close to him, and not just his arms. He wrapped his legs around me too, and with all 4 of his limbs pressed me to him, embracing me, so that when I breathed in, the air was filtered through him, smelling of alcohol, of course, but also of his own scent that elicited such an animal response from me that so fired me up. I imagined the chambers of the brain lighting up, thrown switches in a house. He lay like some marine creature wrapped around me, wrapping around me again if I shifted or half woke, and I slept as I have seldom slept, deeply and almost without disturbance, held like his beloved or his child, or held, I suppose it must be said, like his captive or his prey. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to read just from the beginning of Homegoing. The night Afia Otre was born, into the musky heat of Fanti land, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air, it slept in caves and hidden trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached an Ashanti village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kobi Otre, left his first wife, Baba, with a new baby so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kobi had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." The villagers began to say that the baby was born of the fire, that this was the reason Baba had no milk. Afia was nursed by Kobi's second wife, who had just given birth to a son 3 months before. Afia would not latch on, and when she did, her sharp gums would tear at the flesh around the woman's nipples until she became afraid to feed the baby. Because of this, Afia grew thinner, skin on small bird-like bones with a large black hole of a mouth that expelled a hungry cry which could be heard throughout the village, even on the days Baba did her best to smother it, covering the baby's lips with the rough palm of her left hand. "Love her," Kobi commanded, as though love were as simple an act as lifting food up from an iron plate and past one's lips. At night, Baba dreamed of leaving the baby in the dark forest so that the god Nyame could do with her as he pleased. Afia grew older. The summer after her 3rd birthday, Baba had her first son. The boy's name was Fifi, and he was so fat that sometimes when Baba wasn't looking, Afia would roll him along the ground like a ball. The first day that Baba let Afia hold him, she accidentally dropped him. The baby bounced on his buttocks, landed on his stomach, and looked up at everyone in the room, confused as to whether or not he should cry. He decided against it, but Baba, who had been stirring benku, lifted her stirring stick and beat Afia across her bare back. Each time the stick lifted off of the girl's body, it would leave behind hot, sticky pieces of benku that burned into her flesh. By the time Baba had finished, Afia was covered with sores, screaming and crying. From the floor, rolling this way and that on his belly, Fifi looked at Afia with his saucer eyes, but made no noise. Kobi came home to find his other wives attending to Afia's wounds and understood immediately what had happened. He and Baba fought well into the night. Afia could hear them through the thin walls of the hut where she lay on the floor, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. In her dream, Kobi was a lion and Baba was a tree. The lion plucked the tree from the ground where it stood and slammed it back down. The tree stretched its branches in protest, and the lion ripped them off one by one. The tree, horizontal, began to cry red ants that traveled down the thin cracks between its bark. The ants pooled on the soft earth around the top of the tree trunk. And so the cycle began. Baba beat Afia. Kobi beat Baba. By the time Afia had reached age 10, she could recite a history of the scars on her body. The summer of 1764, when Baba broke yams across her back, the spring of 1767, when Baba bashed her left foot with a rock, breaking her big toe so that it now always pointed away from the other toes. For each scar on Afia's body, there was a companion scar on Baba's, but that didn't stop mother from beating daughter, father from beating mother. Matters were only made worse by Afia's blossoming beauty. When she was 12, her breasts arrived, 2 lumps that sprung from her chest, as soft as mango flesh. The men of the village knew that first blood would soon follow, and they waited for the chance to ask Baba and Kobi for her hand. The gifts started. One man tapped palm wine better than anyone else in the village, but another's fishing nets were never empty. Kobi's family feasted off of Afia's burgeoning womanhood. Their bellies, their hands were never empty.
I'm going to read from about the middle of the book, a chapter called Yeongju, and it's both foreign, inspired by a North Korean friend of mine who crossed and lost his entire family in the process. Yeongju. These were my first images of the safe house. The gas lantern that missionary Kwan had me raise above our heads that turned us into skulls without bodies as he introduced us to our caretaker, Missionary Lee. Missionary Lee's ink-smudged fingers sweeping across his face and the blue streak they left on his nose. The voices of trees caressing the 2-story brick building. The boys' faces glowing with hope. Missionary Kwan had driven us past a town that thinned into a desolate fringe of construction projects, a rusted crane, then whittled down into barren country roads. One road led to a bridge built across a trickle of a stream to a gate, behind which was our building. Though I was a storm of feeling, the night was as calm and cool as a sheet of glass, the yard of weeds as thick as a vagabond's stubble. Then we were shuttled up exposed cement blocks that served as stairs into a common room, down a narrow corridor, and into the few unfinished rooms that we would live in. Taehan said, "Wait for me," though there was nowhere to go, and scrambled to my side, as if I could protect him, as if I could protect anyone. Missionary Kwan extended his arms, his smile as heavy as a large stone. He told us that this God of theirs would love us. You see, he said, God always provides. In the lantern's light, he gave us a lengthy introduction to Missionary Lee. "I'm so happy to see you here, all safe." Missionary Lee's voice was so frail that it seemed to sink into his elephantine girth. "I've been praying for you every day since Missionary Kwan told me about you. You must be Yeongju, and you Taehan, and you Baekjun." As he called out our names one by one, he embraced each of us, though our clothes were crusty and we stank of alcohol. "I'll have to document this." Missionary Kwan directed us to stand against a slab of scarred concrete and pulled out a camera from his bag. I felt as if I were in a war movie, a prisoner with infested hair about to be executed by American soldiers, which remind me of my 어머님. Everything reminded me of my 어머님, mother. "You think I like this?" Missionary Kwan said, though no one had said anything. "Sponsors want evidence. There's not a thing we can do about it." He took several photographs and encouraged us to look solemn, though the camera is clicking. Late that night, after we had our first baths, he took another set of photos of us cleaned up and told us to smile. The camera, the first time I'd seen such a camera, spat out squares of glossy white paper that turned us into our ghostly images within minutes. The boys crowded around to see themselves the same way they had after Missionary Kwan had taken photos of us in the mountains. Namil was grinning in nearly every shot, but his eyes stayed mournful, and Chalmin's skin was flaky and reptilian, but my image alarmed me most. My gaze was gaunt, ashen. Loss had passed over my face, and I had become a different person.